great to see all of you here. The packed room here we have, and to those of you here today, there's obviously no need to introduce Professor Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, our 2012 Antipode lecturer. She is a university professor at Columbia, a distinction that is conferred only upon a handful of faculty at that university. But far more important for all of us here is that Gayatri Spivak is a scholar, teacher, educator, and activist without parallel. We have followed her writings with amazement, exhilaration, insight, and epiphany, and yes, befuddlement and consternation. But above all, the sense of accompanying with missteps and an acute sense of self-vigilance, a peerless scholar whose readings of texts, unforgiving in rigor, are nevertheless intensely passionate and committed, and never far away from the question of responsibility, of what it means to be an ethical subject. We have learned from her, as perhaps from no one else, how to use, while always holding in tension, Marxism, feminism, and deconstruction. Deconstruction in Professor Spivak's operations becomes a force of dislocation that defamiliarizes, wrenching texts away from their sedimented moorings. As Marxist geographers, we have learned from her how to read Marx with Hegel, through Hegel, against Hegel, in excess of Hegel. Thus, in Critique of Postcolonial Reason, Professor Spivak notes, I quote, Marx dockets the Hegelian system in the narrative time of Das Hauben, the effort of sublating, rather than the graphic time of Abhabebung, the accomplished sublation. A small remark that strikes with the force of epiphany, opening up Marx's dialectic in wondrous ways. Or, as radical geographers committed to feminist and post-colonial critique, we have learned the importance of disrupting the intellectual's complicity in an epistemic violence that persistently constitutes the other as the self's shadow. Thus, her stark and simple injunction in the chapter on history, again in Critique of Postcolonial Reason, which is directed as much at progressive third world scholars as at Western radical intellectuals. And she says, I quote, to confront them, subaltern others, is not to represent them, but to learn to represent ourselves. Refusing the easy embrace or rejection of both universal and particular, she has taught us how the ethical moment of justice is an aporetic one, a passage through a non-passage. This is, we believe, Professor Spivak's first appearance at a formal meeting of geographers. Is that correct? Yes. The editors of Antipode are honored, thrilled, surprised, humbled that you agreed to deliver the 2012 Antipode lecture. Please join us in welcoming Professor Spivak, and please stay with us for the reception after. Professor Spivak.
Thank you very much for such a fulsome introduction, but everybody knows that introductions must be fulsome, so I will simply accept that I'm all of those wonderful things. Why not? I'm too old to say, no, please forgive me, I'm not that good, etc. So there we go. It is really true that this is, and Nick has told me that I have 40 minutes to speak. That's a hard thing for me. I like to go on and on, I talk a lot, but I'll try to make myself shut up when 40 minutes are over. Let me tell you this, when in 1955 I graduated high school, I have to say that I was only 13 years old, because otherwise you'd think I'm older than I am. I was a bit of an infant prodigy, but it equals out in the end. But at any rate, when I graduated high school, matriculated into the University of Calcutta, I got a letter in geography. It's a very important thing. That was the only letter I got. I could draw freehand a map of the new India, which in 1955 was pretty new, you know, just 8 years after independence, cut down, you know, I'm a Bengali, Bengal was cut down, and I could also draw freehand all of the currents in the oceans of the world. And now I feel that that particular combo, that is to say, you know, nation-state map and the currents in the sea, to an extent, it has that's kind of the way I've worked for you count, for the rest of the years. Now, and today I feel that at last my examiners who decided that I deserved this letter, at last they're justified, because, hey, I've been invited by a collection of pretty elite radical geographers to give a keynote. I feel good. Anyway, so yes, Bifaram, what I'm going to do, you see, because I'm not a disciplinary geographer, I said to Nick that I would like, I had really no idea in what way I had been important for geographers. I'm very humble that they thought I had been. I work as best I can, and I find that because perhaps I'm not very much of a specialized scholar, I reinvent the wheel, but it's also true that people on the sort of radical fringes of many, many disciplines find something to listen to, at least, if not learn from, and this instructs me. So I told Nick that's in fact why I accepted Vinayak. There's no surprise there, because at this point, putting myself in this position, I can learn. So I said to him, I don't know in what way I am influential for geographers, please send me some questions. And I must say I got very fine questions, and I'm going to actually tackle some of them, and to an extent I'm going to speak from work in progress. One of them is about cosmopolitanism. Another one is about planetarity. Another one is a little bit about both of those together, but also about worlding. But the one that I liked best of all came from, there are two that I liked, because I like people who are a little bit, you know, a little bit angular. One says, in your book, Death of a Discipline, you talk about planetarity, which means including all cultures in a single group. It doesn't mean that at all. I wasn't making myself clear. Now, why do you use an unclear language for expressing your own ideas? Don't you think this fact excludes those people who are not capable of understanding? I tell you, my friend, you've hit it on the head. This is true. But if you think that I want to make myself unclear, this is a problem. What I say to myself when I don't understand something is I push myself to see if perhaps I can do something about it. I don't think I'm not capable of understanding. But at any rate, I'm sorry, so what I'll do is I will begin perhaps with the idea of planetarity. When I began talking about planetarity, and I must say that there is I was also sent some articles, there is a dazzling piece called, what is it now? Rethinking Planetary Futures by Tariq Jazil. Dazzling. I mean, I wrote in the margin at a certain point, wow. And he actually takes the point that my notion of planetarity is not like this little postcard that I picked up, which really seems to me to be a pretty meretricious thing about community and the globe and so on, join, get involved and so on. It's not, my idea of planetarity is not in fact that at all. What I really was talking about when I invoked the planet was that something should remind us of the limit to what we do. That's all it was. Something should remind us of the limit to what we do. And there's nothing particularly strange about that. This particular idea has been around for a long time. And in fact, this idea is emphasized by a man called John Dupre, who's very far ahead in genomics, who is really ranting, as I rant, against rational choice and also radical expectations. And in this particular article, the idea of Paul Gilroy about planetarity and so on is questioned, and cosmopolitanism is questioned, because the author writes, two of them together actually, they write that the idea of cosmopolitanism brings with it the entire load of European thinking about universality, very marked, very specific to a certain civilizational narrative that we should be aware of even when we try to talk about vernacular cosmopolitanism and so on. And I quite agree there. What I would like to draw your attention to, after I say another word or two about planetarity, is the second part of the word cosmopolitanism. Not the word cosmos, but the word polytheia. See, the thing is that I am not at all an etymologist. I think it's a bad idea to say, let's go back to the Greek origins, democracy and so on. Let's go back to the Greek origins and see the true meaning. I'm not doing it in that way. I'm doing it in a heuristic way, in a political way, because people forget that last bit. Polytheia, planetarity and cosmopolitanism will be going together in my discourse, since I only have 40 minutes. So a little bit of cosmopolitanism now. Polytheia means, after all, constitutions. Constitutions. I mean, to call Plato's Republic, that's a Renaissance mistake in translation. Nobody corrected it. The res publica comes in with the Roman Republic. What Plato is writing about, as anybody who reads Plato's Republic, Polytheia is the Greek title, knows that it's about constitutions. And the old man doesn't like democracy all that much. There is that double bind between merit and mathematics and so on. It's a problem, democracy. It contains that problem today. In fact, I heard a graduate student paper yesterday in my class, or day before yesterday in my class, where he was bringing up that same problem as he sees it declared in W.E.B. Du Bois, without realizing that it's also in Plato and Aristotle. It's a problem which should make us work, opening the space of education, and I'll come there. But at any rate, so Polytheia is constitutions. And as everybody knows, the big invocation of cosmopolytheia is at Kant. So also in this crowd, everybody knows that at that point in time, what's happening is that Europe is getting access to its colonies. And so it is possible for Europe to think a cosmos. And therefore, Kant starts talking about cosmopolytheia, and that's about world governance. It's not about feeling that you are labor export. Trust me, there's something so cruel about saying that labor export coming from all different parts of the world, because they have realized that there are different parts of the world and different languages, that's a cosmopolitanism, there's something very cruel in saying that. It's a kind of wish fulfillment. That no, listen, there's also cosmopolitanism down below. No, it's about world governance. And I wrote some time ago that if indeed we are going to think about vernacular cosmopolitheia to be there actively, and I'll come back to planetary, for vernacular cosmopolitheia to be there actively, what there would have to be is there must be a world governmentalized evenly for a corrective vernacular cosmopolitanism to work. It is not enough to hang on to the colloquial sense and suggest, as does my colleague and friend Bruce Robbins, that vernacular cosmopolitanism is just a change of definition. Let us rescue the word into its political meaning. To suggest now that global minorities, labor export, paperless immigrant women, achieve cosmopolitanism is to forget that they must exist in race-class divided situations where it is impossible to feel or exercise the sense of general equality that must be the definitive predication of epistemic cosmopolitanism. Restricted solidarities, unregarding of national origin in immigrant oppression, cannot be called cosmopolitanism. Today's global cosmopolitan looks more like this, and some of you have read this piece, I know, because it's related to geography, Megacity. Some of you have read this. And there I describe today's global cosmopolitan person, my informant, this relaxed, good-looking man, going slightly thick in the middle with stress and easy living, described himself in effect as a member of the cosmopolitan culture, very good telecom links abroad, traveling abroad incessantly, making $1 salary but living in India, free to be globally mobile in skills with aspirations glued in. I had introduced him with the gender division of labor and the culture of the megacity, for the husband, business and globalization, for the wife, child rearing and Americanization. That connection remains unmade. So to an extent, when we think about cosmopolitheia, let us not just think about cosmos. Let us think about polytheia. It's about, if you wanted me to talk about the problems and the tension between so-called world governance and the incredible need to keep borders alive by capital, which is supposed to be borderless, that's another one. But I must really say a little more about planetarity. So therefore, this idea of a cosmopolitanism, which can only be approached through the performative contradiction of finance capital, which needs to keep borders, your geographers, not frontiers, but borders alive because it is borderless, so that the difference in foreign exchange, not just between the global north and the global south, but also in the global north, yen, euro, dollar and dollar, they're different, and dollar, the flow as much as possible both ways, so that the turnover, circulation time makes it expand. So the GDP is just 2% of the entire finance capital turnover, which is why we are in the crisis, the slow taking away of the New Deal. That particular situation, which proves at once the borderlessness of capital and its need to keep borders alive, that goes with this kind of reaction formation, this excuse-making of various kinds of cosmopolitanism available below. And I think what we need to look at is the way in which these two things, and here I'm with David Harvey, the ways in which, in fact, these two things work together. That's one of the things that, and in fact, the working class factory floor has been so pulverized, and this is a word that I get from the wonderful old journal which still publishes, Asia Labor Monitor, this word, pulverized, that in fact there cannot be any kind of effort against this, that is where the agency is labor. So this particular problematic, as it were, is what we should think about when we are thinking about cosmopolitanism. There is no room to talk about cosmopolitanism in a colloquial way, as if it's simply a sense of the world. Now let me go back a little to planetary again. What I had invoked there as a literary critic was that the planet, that word, the planet is not available to us. We are on loan in the planet. The planet, as the word is used, in order, and this already in the articles that I was sent, someone truly understood. The planet is not a natural, undifferentiated space for us to be resource-saving about. The planet, that's not the word. The word, in fact, what we really need to think about when we want to be environmentally savvy and so on, and you know this in this room, is that the world is differentiated in ways which have to be attacked in another way. What way? I'll come to that too before we leave. So I had said that the planet is in the species of alterity. This perhaps my complainant had found too hard to understand. What I was doing was I was rewriting, not repeating. I'll come to repeating in a minute. I was rewriting or iterating an old Latin tag in the species of eternity, subspecie aeternitatis. If you are trying to discuss something and you are more or less tied to the topics and events and arguments of the situation itself, someone might ask you to think about this not just tied to the current situation, but subspecie aeternitatis, as if there is no time, right? And so I had changed that one, species of eternity, to species of alterity. It is so other that it cannot be a consolidating other for us, because the planetary system is not over against us. No human collectivity, no animate collectivity living on a planet can have planetarity as its self-consolidating other, and this should give us pause. I mean, the fact that we are going to make ourselves extinct is part of the natural history of the planet. So to an extent, I mean, it isn't even anything. I mean, I say it that way because I cannot say it any other way. So to an extent, everything we do or say, good or bad, thinking, not thinking, is to stay the horror of the randomness of planetarity. This is a very different thing from, we can't do anything with this. It's really that warning that I had kind of iterated, as indeed, that this is why I had quoted Laurie Anderson, who had said the same thing, that what she is if she remembers when she is resident artist in NASA, is, and I quote, that human beings are worms. On the other hand, when Gilroy is talking about planetarity and one-worldness, etc., he quotes someone from that first moon voyage who says, looking at the moon, it's a beautiful passage in the articles that I was sent, looking at the moon all round, and from the moon looking at the earth all round, with no people there at all, it is possible to think that we are one world. Why do we fight among nations? This is a kind of US. And I was very amused as I was waiting outside, a young geographer speaking to another young geographer, complaining about some international conference in some benighted place in the world, saying, you know, they didn't put a bed sheet on the other twin bed because I was just renting a single room. And the woman says, you should have told them we're Americans, we're used to bigger beds. And I thought that this is what tells us about the politics of the discipline of geography, not a room full of radicals who want to listen to me. See what I mean? So, to an extent, that's what I had said about planetarity. It's really not a very useful idea. You cannot be like a planetarist, geographer, etc. You can in the other sense. But in the other sense, of course, you know well that you don't do it just by thinking that the world is an undifferentiated space. Okay, so I've said something about planetarity, and I've said something about cosmopolitanism. Let me now say a little something about worlding. I was asked a question. I was also asked a question by a woman who said, "What would you think if someone said that Marxism, feminism, and deconstruction, these things are now obsolete for the left?" What would I say? I would say, please explain in what ways, because I want to learn from this peculiar statement. So I don't really have very much to say here, but since that person is not here to have a conversation, I'll hold it. But anyway, I got a question which asked me about worlding and also asked me about why I don't use the word territory. Well, here's about worlding. Heidegger. It is from Heidegger, right? In the 80s, I write, looking at the origin of the work of art, I was too quick to think Heidegger's idea was of a worlding specifically upon uninscribed earth. I had been reading and teaching too much Thoreau. No, the point was what in common language we would call development. The work whirls and fulfills the earth's destiny, and the earth fights back. This is Heidegger's notion, reading Heraclitus. This is his notion, summarized in a vulgar way by me. The work whirls and fulfills the earth's destiny, and the earth fights back. I quote in the English translation, in setting up a world, the work sets forth the earth. The work lets the earth be an earth. Could be the motto for the Earth Institute at Columbia. The allegory of the work of art in Heidegger lets me move from colonialism to globality. As he writes, the primitive, I quote again, because it lacks the bestowing, grounding leap and head start, die schenkende, gründende Sprung und Vorsprung. See, it's not just leap and head start, but Sprung und Vorsprung. There's much more in the German. Because it lacks the bestowing, grounding leap and head start, is always futureless. The primitive is always futureless. It is not capable of releasing anything more from itself because it contains nothing more than that in which it is caught. All of this I was paying no attention to when I wrote The Worlding of the World because I was really not thinking about Heidegger carefully. Heidegger goes on to describe, and I quote again, art attaining its historical nature as foundation in the history of Western Europe. Been there, done that, except this is not just colonialism as such. When you look at the resurgence of the idea of cosmopolitanism and its bestowal upon precisely those who are the victims of one kind of globalization, it seems, the unpapered, the so-called undocumented immigrants, they are the new subaltern. And to locate cosmopolitanism in there, this is in fact related to, it's not just colonialism as such, it is something much more complicated in a discipline. In what is called thinking, seminars given in 1951-52, Heidegger suggests that the naming by Western European man of the being of beings as thinking, or thank, as he says, in old Indo-European, thought, thanks, memory in the realm of the unspoken, or enos emenai, as in Parmenides, is called for by the very nature of the being of beings. This is the Euro-teleological talk that is in the account of globalization today. The globalization which has supposedly brought a contemporaneity which is very unlike what we used to have in post-colonial stuff. The story of globalization, the imagined communities after imperialism, modernization, and then the silicon chip and global capital. The only thing that globalizes is capital and data. Everything else is damage control. And part of the damage control is this picture, deeply Euro-teleological picture of a globalization, which in fact shares something with this notion that the very being of beings is called for by the way in which Western European man thinks, what is called thinking, that's the piece. There is nothing to support this claim of Heidegger. My friend Sheldon Pollack's claim that South Asia resembles Western Europe belongs here, I think. The Indo in Indo-European. Those of us who are very strongly critical of what's happening in the Indian Union today, in the name of this, would not go for we can't forget that Sheldon Pollack is also one of the authors of Vernacular Cosmopolitanism. These two things go together. It comes out of a major effort of self-worlding undertaken by European intellectuals anxious to de-Ottomanize. That's another story. Greek history in suppressing traces of the Ottoman is too well known for me to recount here. And of course, what's happening between Turkey and Greece now in the European context, and the extremely rightist, I mean, think of space there, if you would. Think of the Holy Roman Empire, the Eastern Empire, the Western Empire. Somebody asked me, I think one of the questions was, why have I never spoken of territory? I was a little befuddled by that, because I certainly have talked about territory, but I've talked about territory with an adjective, territorial imperialism, and its slow sublation into its becoming an inconvenience. So that what happens when this new borderlessness, which I just spoke about in terms of capitals, borderlessness, which by performative contradiction requires the bordering of borders in a certain way, not demographic borders, but virtual borders, as it were, that same thing made my adjective territorial move into something else. But the idea of the very right-wing peace and justice foreign minister taking the entire former Balkan part of the Ottoman Empire as simply his neighbors and beginning to do conflict resolution, that is a real territorial invitation to rethink what is not called Europe when we say Euro-teleological. So to that extent, it seems to me that that is also part of the burden of that worlding that Heidegger was talking about. Our new task of worlding is to instrumentalize the insights, setting them free of the as-if world that they had taken as felicitous. In this spirit, a cosmopolitan worlding may think of all worlding as the coming into light, concealed from us as unconcealment. Worlding in general, not Heidegger reading Heraclitus because he's a European reading the Greeks, but by chance, alighting upon the universalizable. I'm not going to be able to follow that through if I'm going to keep, I think I'm already almost 25 minutes, so I have another 15. I want to now talk very, very briefly about this idea from one of my questioners, if I can find the page, about the being able to think good globalization, and his idea that if the subaltern is a space of complete heterogeneity, then how can we do anything with the subaltern? And finally, his idea that it was incorrect of me to have muted the subaltern. That's, of course, a very old complaint, and I'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, good globalization. Yes, there's a name for it, international socialism, because that is also globalization. Now, international socialism has an ethics-shaped whole. To that extent, I mean, somebody in one of these papers calls Gramsci a vanguardist. Remember, Gramsci never wrote a book. The Modern Prince and so on, those were put together by Togliatti and then the English translators. There's not Gramsci was writing notes to himself so that he could perhaps at some point, bibliographies at some point, write a book. So, and of course it didn't happen, he died. But the thing about this notion of international socialism, that the problem is held in it's held in the fact that this can only happen if the individuals who make, this is not individualism, the individuals who make up the polity, if in them is nurtured a will to social justice, which is very different from self-interest. And there are some, if you may call them welfare statist communists. I mean, I'm thinking about Rosa Luxemburg, I'm thinking certainly about Gramsci, whatever you want to call them. I'm not into labels at this point because, again, you know, time goes on. I don't care much anymore what you call me. But to that extent, if you call them that, that's cool too. But the idea is very strong in all of them, that which is very unlike Lenin's What Is to Be Done, that this is not bringing class consciousness to the masses. No, class is an abstract thing. Their idea, and I have many quotes, which obviously I'm not going to use because now it's 10 minutes, but their idea is that in order to be able to think of a polity that remains something like a good globalization, there has to be something like people nurtured into an education that is not just based on self-interest, which is, of course, I also read some pieces here about resistance movements. And the resistance movements that are focused on self-interest, justified self-interest, as they should not be made as we sit at conferences and go to universities and we go around checking which university would be good for our children and so on. It's tremendous bad faith. Should not be made into the arbiter of theoretical excellence, especially not in the theorizing of agency. The fact of justified self-interest is a fact that we should support as damage control of the cognitive and non-cognitive crimes of history. They are not models for resistance. This is something that the academic finds hard to accept because they can very easily put themselves in certain kinds of leadership roles by joining. Believe me, I know that temptation very well, and because my own inclination, not because I'm a good person, but because I'm extremely intellectually cautious. I don't want to do anything which will make me feel at the end of the day that I got to achieve something intellectually. So therefore I'm very careful not to give in to these kinds of invitations that come to lead these groups in one way or another, because there's always a kind of fringe, vanguardist fringe, which likes people who have schools in rural India and so on and so forth. I have no interest in doing that kind of thing because the people I respect, in fact, ask for a space of education where I could, again, you know, this is part of what I'm teaching. There are two of my students who are in the seminar. I hope they are here in this room, because this is what I'm teaching, reading these people. My course is called Imagining the General Strike. This opening up of a space and worrying about the ways in which one can indeed, even from within vanguardism, and we're all in the vanguard here, from within vanguardism, one can make some space for the instrumentalized intellectual to, in fact, think about what Du Bois would call unfaltering communication with the stars. Right after emancipation, the Negro needs food, clothing, and shelter, but also and at once unfaltering communication with the stars. This is the question. The question is, how does one sustain something like a good globalization? This is where this persistent space of nurturing a will to social justice rather than simply the freedom to have self-interest answered. This is a very difficult thing, from freedom from to freedom to. So to an extent, that's my interlocutor, my questioner who asked me, we should be able to think a good globalization. Indeed, there's the answer, because I am by conviction a pacifist international socialist. And this is why I can say that it has an ethics-shaped hole, which is the space of... Now, remember, the real problem also, as I said, only capital and data travel globally. Everything else is damage control. Remember that in any good globalization must have some global languages. You lose a world that way, because it is from the first language learning mechanism before reasonableness that you indeed lay the basis of the ethical semiosis, which, like muscular memory, it sets to work what is meta-psychological, because in the child, as he or she is learning the first language, the psychological resources of rational training they are not yet developed. So to that extent, if we only keep ourselves confined to the few big languages required by good globalization, we will not be able to make of the globe a world. And so this is supplementation. Supplementation by the world's wealth of languages. And remember, since I'm really coming to an end here, remember that supplementation is dangerous because it opens up onto the incalculable. There's the horror of planetarity. It opens up into the incalculable. What can that mean? People who speak about interdisciplinarity should keep this in mind. A discipline, because I am here, one of my interlocutors claimed a natural interdisciplinarity for geography because it goes all the way from big quantification to critical geographers who talk like humanities folks. Sure, that is interdisciplinary, but the way in which a disciplinary formation, even institutionalized as interdisciplinary, works, that it shapes the mind to form objects of knowledge in a certain way. We know this. And a disciplinary formation is extremely necessary. There's something like it even before you come into the university. Even uninstructed people have something. You can't call it discipline because discipline has been claimed by institutions of education. But the way in which an object of knowledge, it's very easy. I mean, in immigration, the mother thinks honor, the daughter thinks reproductive rights. There you go. That's a kind of disciplinary epistemological change, which is not discipline in the sense of university education. But at any rate, a discipline teaches you how to construct an object for knowing. You will, in fact, go toward other disciplines with that particular formation. And this is not something that is to be regretted. It is to be resisted, but it is not something that is to be regretted. 5 minutes? Feel free to talk longer. No, I won't do it. I'd much rather hear your questions. So therefore, and have questions. So therefore, when we say interdisciplinarity, we should keep in mind that real interdisciplinarity opens up to that element of the incalculable. And so rather than control things by disciplinarization of the other discipline, or borrow vocabulary, this is always necessary to realize. I have written many things which are called scattered speculations on this and that. Right? When I do that, that means I'm in the element of the incalculable. I'm trying to be interdisciplinary, knowing that my disciplinary formation, very strong Brit-Lit formation taught by wonderful teachers in dhotis at the University of Calcutta, because all men then, I graduated in 1959. So my disciplinary formation is to learn how to learn from the singular and the unverifiable. That's literary training at its best, isn't it? And also how to be completely literal. These three things have taken me a long way. But I can only be interdisciplinary. I'm thinking about the question of value, for example, from this disciplinary formation. And that's why I call those things always scattered speculations, because the incalculable, my little disciplinary formation, does not allow me to calculate with those kinds of things, because they ask for a different kind of epistemological performance, isn't it? So keep that in mind, that a discipline is not by its nature interdisciplinary. All good disciplines are by its nature interdisciplinary. There is this kind of challenge in it. And then the question that came with this, if the subaltern is a totally heterogeneous space, what are we going to do with it? Well, that's a problem, isn't it? But one of you, the Sharad Chari, subalternities that matter in times of crisis, in fact, came close to what I was trying to say. That the subaltern is not a space of heterogeneity. If you only read Can the Subaltern Speak, which was given more than 30 years ago, then I think I would ask you to read a bit more. I've written a great deal about that question. But even there, it's not a space of heterogeneity. The problem is that the subaltern, which is a position without identity, even in the military idea, where Gramsci began because of various reasons that we know, what does it mean? It means the group that only takes orders. That's the subaltern. Now, to an extent, the subaltern, according to Gramsci's definition, very classic definition, are classes that have not achieved the state. So, it is very hard to actually write, as Gramsci says, to write about the subaltern. Because this is not a space of absolute heterogeneity. I may have said this in 1982, but time has run on. I've written a lot more. I used to believe in all kinds of, I used to believe in a certain kind of post-coloniality before I realized I was a post-colonial. And so, but things change, and especially people like me, learning from their mistakes, say different things as they move on. I may have said it, so don't come back at me and say, look, here's your book. But I'm saying now, as I've been saying for the last 10, 15 years, that this idea, it's not the radical alterity. I talked about radical alterity, didn't I? So radical that it can't even be your self-consolidating space of being nice and growing beings. But this subalternity is a position without identity. It is an absence of access to the possibility of the abstract structures of the state, the possibility of. So this particular situation is where, now the South Asian subaltern studies were very different because they went into a colonial situation where there was a super proliferation of records. So as they were reading from the elite texts to deduce a subaltern consciousness. But basically what we see today as a good, solid definition of subalternity is the idea of no access to the structures of citizenship, to the structures of the state. And this is becoming more and more a problem as so-called cosmopolitanism, the real solid meaning, world governance, is failing through international civil society, the UN, and the human rights making the state less than accountable. Although you know this story, the so-called structuring, etc. If one really wants to take a good look at this, one looks at the way in the United States how the federal government fought the states as they were trying to keep a hold, a little bit of a regulation after the investment banks and the commercial banks had been collapsed. So to an extent, there's the subaltern. The subaltern who does not have, it's a position without identity. It can be a man, a woman, an animate being, and anything, so any person, anything that has a life can be a subaltern. It's a position without identity. So it's not a space of heterogeneity at all. And this is where Gramsci is very useful, when you see all of this critique of governmentality and so on. This is a bit scary when we are dealing with people who have had no access to the structures of the state. Gramsci, on the other hand, sitting in his jail cell, unlike Althusser, unlike the French thinkers, knew that all of these things could be both medicine and poison. It depended on how one used them. So that's what subalternity is. It's a space where the intellectual instrumentalizes himself or herself in order to go into the learning from below how, in fact, to think about a polity willing social justice rather than acting only in self-interest, generation after generation. This is a very different view from just simply a critique of governmentality and biopower and so on. It's a complicated thing. So, therefore, as I say, the subaltern is not a space of heterogeneity. It is a position without identity. where the intellectual is instrumentalized, and I quote Gramsci, mistranslated, where the environment, the subaltern environment, becomes the master and the intellectual the disciple. What Gramsci is trying to do is supplementing a necessary but impossible vanguardism rather than simply being a vanguardist. It's a very interesting thing that one can look at. One can look at Du Bois. I'm not going to do it. The last thing, why did I mute the subaltern? The person who wrote this did not even read that old essay carefully. The subaltern did not speak to him. He thought that the subaltern being mute had to do with the fact that although the British very correctly made widow burning, very correctly, an unquestioned good, I say, made widow burning criminal, neither the British nor the Indian reformers really engaged the subjectivity of the woman in the way in which colonial subjectship did. I know what I'm talking about. My great-grandmother was married at 5, widowed at 11, married again and given in remarriage at 13. Big reform gesture, widow remarriage. No one ever thought about how she was a smart woman too. I never saw her, but she became a pawnbroker because that's the only she wanted to be independent. My mother gave them unredeemed earrings to me, saying, in your generation, you're the most independent woman, as my grandmother used to be, so that, women could come with the ghungats down and jewelry to get an honest pawnbroker. She would, in the back of her house, she had a little shop because she wanted to do something. But no one ever asked her. Well, so I'm not saying something madly theoretical. Ranjit Guha has just published in Bengali a book called Daya, which I did look at, where all of Ram Mohan Roy's thoughts about this helping the satis and so on are contained, but no one thinks about the subjectivity of the women. This is fine, but that's not why I said, can the subaltern speak? I said, can the subaltern, there you are, someone knows. I said, can the subaltern speak? And no, because a woman who had tried not to be in this mindset and had waited 4 days to hang herself so that she would menstruate at 17, so that no one would think that she was just bespoke to one man and it was an illicit pregnancy. In 2 generations, the women in the family, the women in her family, a highly educated woman, I will say for the Indians present here, first class first in philosophy at the University of Calcutta, the woman who had forgotten that this earlier person who hanged herself in this way by waiting at 17 because she was in this anti-imperial struggle, that it was there, I had said, that she wanted to speak even by inscribing her body through gendering. No one heard her. That's why I said in a very violent and enraged rhetorical voice, the subaltern cannot speak. That is not to be taken as an expository sentence. If somebody says, after a great deal of tribulation, there is no justice, that is not an expository sentence, which means justice is nowhere to be found in the world. So I would say to my friend who thinks that I made the subaltern mute, first of all, think about what the subaltern is. It's not a space of heterogeneity, it's an absence from the structures of the state. So these were indeed the questions that were asked. I think I am probably not going to talk any further now. The idea of geography to me is of great interest because the idea is a human idea. I say human, there is nothing else that I can say, because when I try to think animate, it is only through my human intelligence that I can say it. Therefore, with all of it is by making the idea of the human a kind of grounding error that I move into this, but I was able to say in my nationalism and the imagination that even animals of a certain kind, of a certain level, they mark out space in certain ways so that this production of space, because by now for me, The space-place arguments are rather been there, done that, have the t-shirt. Because in the production space and so on, of course, because in the finance capital situation that I was talking about, borders required by borderlessness, that particular argument holds, but it's not all that salient, just as the post-colonial certainly holds, but it's not all that salient. We have to think differently, epistemological performance of a different sort. So, there you are, here are the answers then to your question. If you think that this relates to geography in any way, I'm grateful. I think what I would say is that the graphing has now gotten so out of hand that although I know that there is no ground that I stand on, there is no I that stands. I know all of those things. Remember, I translated that big book in '67. But it is also true that in Circumfessions, trying to prove Jeff Bennington wrong about deconstruction, the first thing that Derrida said was, someone in the audience will remember, le vocable cru, the raw voiced word, the raw vowel, that's what I want now. There was another essay which says, what if there is nothing but the vulgar concept of time, after all of the stuff? So this thing has to reverse upon itself. It can't become a kind of fundamentalism of its own. So what I really have said here, again I cite John Dupre, the genomics expert, is that we ought to think about reversing and displacing rather than going on and on about, as in the postcard or as in the international conference goers' remark about the twin bed, going on and on about the global and the community, the global and the local. The time for displacement is always what Benjamin called the Jetztzeit, the now time, not which flashes up and gives you a sense of the historical moment. I think we have brought ourselves there. And so the critical geographers who think like humanists should perhaps be addressed in a rather different way as the engineers of displacement rather than people who are in a fringe over against this the graphing of the geo, which doesn't graph a geo anymore. It's become something by itself, and that universalist transgression of the graphing of what used to be geography, has to be curbed by this other kind of feeling for the vocable cru and for the trace rather than the sign system. On the word trace, I will end rather than explain what I mean by that. If a question comes, that will be fine. If not, this is where I say thank you.